Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. It is a Last Legend Yashima 4000 series, and this is a little bit of a different video because it's more of a nostalgia trip down memory lane, if you will, from a time in the early aughts when Last Legend was operational, from when I remember seeing their swords. And unfortunately, they're not available today, and they're becoming increasingly rare to find in the wild. But Last Legend is a cool company, and for those of you that don't know the context around them, this is a good chance to share it with you because this sword is like a dream sword. It's one of their higher-end offerings with all of the bits and bobs that I would have probably chosen were I to buy a sword from Last Legend back in the day. If I had that kind of money back then, or was in the market to get one, then this may have been the sword that I chose. Probably not, because I tended to fancy big dumb swords at the time. But anyway, this Yashima is a little bit refined, a little bit nice, and certainly one of the higher end offerings, one of their cooler things, and so it's a good chance to share it with you. But before I do, a couple notes. One, this is a second-hand piece. It may not be representative of what Last Legend sold at the time or the condition. Unfortunately, they're all second-hand now. You're not able to buy from Last Legend. They went out of business. I don't exactly know when, and I honestly don't know the reason they went out of business. I did hear that there was a fire that they didn't recover from. I don't know the truth of that. I'm not a historian. And part of me speculates it might have been the entitlements that they were, the warranty that they put in place. So they had in some cases, if you break it, we'll replace it for you style warranty. And I've heard that they were pretty generous with that. And you can imagine if there are users, customers like me out there, that would be a costly thing to fill against. So, I do speculate that may have had a part, but honestly, I don't know the truth of it. I do know they offered lots of cool stuff, and I do know that they went out of business some time ago. Anyway, the Yashima is one of the series they had. One of the other differentiators that Last Legend is cool for is that they had offerings with deep Sori, which is not something that you commonly see today. They made competition-style cutters with, almost Hirazakuri, really high shinogi style blades. They basically made different shapes. They had things with and without bohi. They offered a lot of innovative things where you could buy a Last Legend Yashima style sword like this if you like the shape, but buy it in a through hardened, less expensive, around $300 or $400 variety, and you could customize it with some of the bits and bobs and common things that sword users tend to favor. There were simple options for reversing the minuki. There were simple options for changing the length of the grip or the handle, and they weren't necessarily inexpensive, but they weren't, they were available and easy to pick from, and it seemed to be a company that was, thoughtful in the minds of sword people because they offered things that really let you tailor your sword without breaking the bank. Now, today, unfortunately, they're not available, and this one is a little bit more of a standard option that's not particularly long, but it has some of the cooler options that were available later in the day. So the Yashima 4000 series, it represents their higher tier of swords. And in the Yashima line of things, they had the 2000 line where you could have a differentially hardened or through hardened blade. I don't recall exactly which was cheaper or better. I want to say they were about the same price, but those 2000 series blades tended to not have much in the way of polish. I believe you could pay more to have a superior polish, and I'm not sure, I don't know that I've ever seen one with a great polish on it. Anyway, that may be an option that I've never seen from them. Regardless though, the 2000 series was pretty basic stuff. The polish was usually pretty rough, and they were relatively inexpensive pieces from around $300 to $400, which is not super inexpensive, but considering they tended to warranty the product, that may have been a reason to go about getting them. At the same time, there was a 3000 series, and that was a folded variety typically, and they tended to have some more elaborate fittings and a few more options. And then the 4000 series was folded one more time, so it had like 8,000 layers. It was a really high layer count blade, and they tended to come with nicer fittings and more interesting stories and more of the options that you see on their website. And this is that. It is a 4000 series Yashima. Now, when I say some of the cool options, Last Legend had fittings that were Last Legend specific. So nowadays, when you go and buy from a lot of the manufacturers out there, they seem to draw from the same parts bins. And so you see a lot of the same fittings, a lot of the same size, a lot of the same options. And there are differences in Hanwei, in Dragon King, in Skydro. Those companies make their own fittings and have unique stuff, unique offerings onto themselves. Last Legend was like that. Now, they're not great, but they are at least different. They're not from the same parts bin, which is kind of nice. So this is supposed to be a set of fittings cast from an old set of fittings that depict a battle in the Genpei War, I believe, and it's just not a set of fittings that you see on other katana. And they suffer from the same problems, though, in the sense that, while it is unique and not something I've seen, it has what looks like finger-painted gold on it, and while it might be cast from an old set of fittings, the casting wasn't particularly detailed, and some of the aspects on it are really quite quite low in terms of standard. It's tough to see if they're cast from an old set of fittings. It either A, wasn't a detailed cast, or B, wasn't a detailed set of fittings, which I think is a missed opportunity. But you do see different shapes, a different story, and something at least with intent. It's not just any old thing. It's a cast set of fittings with a particular story that this blade was trying to tell. So I appreciate that. This one has some silk on it. It's done in gray. I like the color, but I've seen a lot of these silks that come frayed, and so I have a suspicion that many of them new may have come frayed, because this doesn't look like it has a lot of signs of handling, and the spots that I see it frayed don't look like it would have been from people using it. Before I move on from the kasha, though, you might notice that it's bunched up over here. It's canted off to the side. This is glued on, and I don't know if this was done later, but I suspect not, because I don't see a lot of human intervention on here. I think from the factory it was glued on and just done cockeyed and stuck on. So it's a little bit crooked and stuck on there, and not necessarily the greatest way. It's also bunchy. So things in terms of ito that I would complain about today, certainly par for the course. I see the same thing. The knots bulge out, not necessarily a terrible amount, but the fact that the kasha is glued on there with a big ledge that I can feel with my hand, that is a little bit irritating if I use the sword, and it's a little cockeyed, is, goes to show how far we've come, right? The ito is reasonably tight, even today, though. It doesn't move around a lot, so that is something that's better. I also noticed that the diamonds are reasonably well done. They vary in size a little bit, but not a huge amount. I like the black and gold theme as well. They colors thematically, I think, tie in well. The gray, the black same, the gold, and the little accents that are on the fittings. I'll keep my eye from going to one place specifically. And then if I move down here, the fuchi has ledges and things like that I would complain about. Again, the quality is just a little bit muddy. The tsuba is again cast from an old one. It has an interesting shape to it. It looks like it has a raised rim, which is something that, at least thematically, I like what they've done here, but it again has the same kind of crudeness that the other fittings do. If I move down to the saya, this features something Last Legend did well, which is they offered rattan and samegawa as an option for you to put on if you wanted. Now, it's not particularly well executed. There's little flaws and things, and I don't know if it came that way or this one has just fallen prey to age, but there's little bits of missing rattan. They didn't do necessarily the greatest job. But if you're a sword practitioner, having some extra reinforcement around this area to prevent the sword from cutting through and into the meat of your hand is an appreciable thing, particularly for a sharp. So I like that they had these options. They weren't terribly expensive at the time, and you could add them to most saya. Unfortunately, it does look like somebody just took the same saya and then wrapped rattan around it. So the execution wasn't great, but from a practical standpoint, it was a nice feature to have. Apart from that, this is kind of a bog standard black gloss saya. It does have a horn kojiri at the end, I believe. It's been painted over, but I believe it does have some horn parts that have been painted on. The lacquer is cracking in some spots. It's not necessarily great, but it certainly did the job. Rattles, not a whole lot, and draws and tensions are still actually about where they're supposed to be. If I move on to the habaki area here, so Last Legend habaki were the same but a little different in shape than what you typically see on Hanoi. So it was often the same kind of brass or silver looking painted habaki. I've seen some that were silver, but they often fit worse and were a little bit smaller. So they tended to jut out a little bit on the front. They didn't necessarily fit well on the back. Some of them were just pinched on to swords to fit. So they used the same kind of, they cast their own, I believe, but used they weren't great at habaki, I guess I'll say. I've seen many that were misfit. This one is not too bad. It's a little bit on the small side, but at least it's different looking than what you see all over the place today. They had a particular way of grinding in fullers, bohi right here. So as you see the bohi run up the blade, it looked like they had a particular process or grind, because it starts very shallow, but they polished it out and it wasn't necessarily too bad. They also terminated the bohi up at the kissaki reasonably well by modern standards. They didn't just run off at various different places. The kissaki on this one is a little bit odd shaped, I would say. It doesn't have as characteristic a bevel or shape as I would typically see. But it does have some taper that you don't normally see in blades. It thins out a little bit. It has a little bit, well, I'll include dimensions in the description down below. But basically, from a profile standpoint, it just looks a little different than the average katana does today. It has a little bit more dimension, a little bit more shape, and that was something that Last Legend offered. They had also blades with much deeper sori, and you could get koshizori as well if that's a thing that you wanted. They had options for where you wanted the curvature of the blade to be. Now, one thing that I don't think they necessarily did particularly well is the polish on the blades. And as I understand it, there used to be a charge if you wanted a better polish. But this sword is roughly $1,000 with all of the options. It's a 4,000 series. It would have been like 900 something. I don't know if the rattan saya came with that series. In some years it did, and some years I don't think it did. In any case, this is a roughly $1,000 sword, and while the polish is better than many of their lower line swords, it was always a little bit opaque, and you could see that it was folded, but it didn't, well, the features, I guess, didn't jump out at you. You could see it was differentially hardened. You could see that it was folded, but it seemed like it got a heavy acid bath and then kind of cleaned off, and that was it. So maybe I've just never seen one with the more advanced option for polish. In any case, you could kind of see it, but they definitely, I don't think, hit many marks for bringing out the detail in the sword. In terms of balance and use, though, everything that's important, I guess, is addressed. The ito is tight and fit well. It feels good in my hand. The general shape of the handle is good. It draws and sheathes well, and it has a hefty, stout point of balance. They offered a warranty that said if you break it, so I imagine they favored things being a little bit more resilient. But at the same time, it feels agile and nimble for a 29-inch blade. It's overall a pretty nice training companion. All right, sword friends, I am going to try to stop rambling here and say that this has been a fun trip down memory lane. This was a really high-end sword for me, one that I lusted after many, many moons ago, but never had a chance to play with. So it's cool to see this high-end offering from Last Legend, and I do think that they're worthy of your attention if you find them in the wild today, though not at their original price, and certainly not what the inflation would have their original price have been. This was around $1,000 a year, 20 years ago, and what that would be in today's money, I'm not sure, but more than $1,000. At the same time, if you spent $1,000 on a new blade from Huawei, I would argue you get a superior product. You'd lose the folding and some of the other options, but I think what you would get would be much more nipped and tucked and much closer to what a Japanese sword should be than this one is from Last Legend and 20 years ago. Anyway, I do think it's worth it. What it is to you, I'm not sure, but at the same time, I do think they made good swords. If you find them for a good price, they're worthy of attention, especially because the shapes were just kind of cool. Also, I wish more companies made websites that were at least had the simplicity of options that Last Legend did. You went to a family of swords which dictated the general shaping of the blade and then worked from there. Did you want it to be folded, through hardened? Did you want fancy fittings? Did you want a particular size? Did you want rattan? Did you want the minuki reversed? And well, I think some folks still include those options. Last Legend included, I think, the vast majority of what sword people want in the customization options. And I don't see another site that I've seen sites that do it better in some cases, but miss some of those options, and I think it's unfortunate. Last Legend really did do a pretty solid job with that kind of stuff, and I hope to see more of that in the coming days from other sword manufacturers. Anyway, it's been a fun trip down memory lane. Hopefully you've enjoyed seeing a random blast from the past. That's all I've got. Cheers, and thanks for watching.